The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Arguing For or Against Positions. Now this video is going to be, I don't know, there's things that I've talked about but don't always seem clear to people, and so this is an attempt to lay some groundwork for some future videos that I'm going to do and a future discussion that I know I'm going to have. Eric Murphy is doing a new atheist podcast, and one of the things that he asked me to do was these sort of short 1 or 2 minute brain droppings for his video, although we decided to call them better arguments, and the feedback from that's been good. Also, there's a lot of talk about me getting back to the foundational series and doing a little bit more of introduction to logic and reasoning in a way that's approachable. Then there's a disagreement about labels and foundations of epistemology, about what you really are if you're an atheist or what you're arguing for or against. And then someone was kind enough to send me this book, the Evolution Handbook. And while I think if I gave this to someone like Richard Dawkins or Jerry Coyne or any other my other evolutionary biologist friends, they would just chuck it across the room and say there's absolutely no value in going through this scientifically illiterate parade. I am going to talk about some of the things in this book in future videos, and so I want to talk about how to actually kind of address this, and it ties in with all the other things. And that is, are we arguing for something, or are we arguing against something? And there's a number of little caveats that come into this. The first thing to understand is something that I mentioned on Eric's podcast, and that is, if a logical argument is flawed, fallacious, you can use whatever language you want, that does not mean that the conclusion is false. It just means that we don't have reason to believe that it's true, that the argument as presented does not reasonably lead to the conclusion. It's a non sequitur, if you will. This is important because if we were in a position where there were exactly two possibilities, like a perfect coin that had to land heads or tails, and you flip the coin, somebody looked at it, and your friend says, I am convinced that it landed head side up, and they present their reasons, and their reasons are flawed. I'm believing that it landed head side up because today is Tuesday. Well, okay, in that case, my position isn't, I believe it landed tail side up because your argument is flawed. That's not the way that works. We like to think that that's the way it works, that if we can argue against that it landed head side up, then we are arguing for the fact that it landed tail side up. We do this a lot in the conversations about gods. If we argue for reasons that a God doesn't exist, we are arguing for the proposition God doesn't exist. If we point out flaws in the arguments that are about, or that reach the conclusion that a God existed, we're not necessarily arguing for the proposition no God exists. We are arguing against this individual's claims and their reasons for it. This is why I've pointed out many times, you can label this agnosticism or whatever. I don't think that that's accurate. But if someone comes to me and says, I believe the coin landed head side up because it's Tuesday and because I'm so smart, I'm not convinced that the coin landed head side up, or at least I can say I am not convinced for those reasons. Those reasons have nothing to do with whether or not the coin landed head side up, until you actually demonstrate that because you're so smart and because it's Tuesday, these things necessarily lead, or even highly probably lead, to the coin landing head side up. So we view this as, hey, here's somebody who believes in God, and when we're arguing with them, we are arguing that they are wrong. I don't take that position, because in many cases, the God prospect is an unfalsifiable claim. And it would be patently absurd for me to suggest that I have falsified an unfalsifiable claim. When we talk about things in terms of probability, when we do sort of Bayesian analysis of things, I'm not convinced that Bayesian analysis applies in all of these situations, or at least not in the way that it's been used. But I would fully agree that you might be able to make a case, as long as you're not actually doing math and trying to quantify something, that it's more likely than not that a particular God that's being offered or suggested as existing does not exist. But the simple thing is that when somebody presents a claim and I point out flaws in their argument, I'm not saying your conclusion is false. I'm saying your premises, the data, the argument that you've made does not necessarily lead to that conclusion. That's it. I may, in fact, agree with them about their conclusion. I may think that their conclusion is false. I may have peeked at that coin, or I may have given a coin with tails on both sides so that I am extremely confident that it is not heads, no matter what day of the week it is. This strategic idea about how we're going to argue it is about showing whether or not a position is reasonable, not whether or not a position is true. I've talked before about, once upon a time it was reasonable to think that the earth, or that the sun went around the earth. It was perfectly reasonable even though it wasn't true. There are occasions where someone could be making an argument for the existence of God, and they may be correct that there is that God, and yet their argument is so horribly flawed that that conclusion isn't justified by the argument. And if we point that out, if our goal is to say, here's where your argument is flawed, anybody who hasn't spent any time actually trying to understand logic and reasoning is likely to think that you're saying that they are factually wrong about the conclusion rather than they are procedurally wrong about the process that got to it. That's an important distinction to make. The thing is, if we know there are two possibilities and we can show that it is one, we have disproven the other. But if we have an unfalsifiable proposition, that's never an option. You can't falsify the unfalsifiable. And so when we're in those situations, arguing that I am not convinced of your position. There's been lots of disagreement about whether we should use the word I believe. There are people who, for what I think are ridiculous reasons, say we should never use the word believe. We should only talk about what we know. Well, that's absurd. Knowledge is a subset of belief. There's tons of things that I believe, and I believe them for good reasons, and I'm convinced that they're right, and some of them may count as knowledge. I shouldn't be afraid of the word believe, because all I mean by that is I am convinced that this is the case, or I am convinced that this is likely the case. And so if that word still has a problem for you, just toss it out and point out that their argument isn't convincing, or that their argument is flawed. Their conclusion may still be true, but we can't establish that. And that's a more honest way to approach it. Where this gets tricky is you'll often see creationists who spend all of their time and energy arguing against evolution. But evolution and creation aren't the only two possible explanations. I would agree that by and large they seem mutually exclusive, despite what some people like to claim of, evolution is true, but God tinkered. They're detecting the undetectable, kind of a false positive there. But for the creationists who want to keep pointing out all the flaws in evolution, they aren't really any significant steps closer to showing that their creation model is correct. Just like if we pointed out problems with the with an Earth-centered universe, we haven't shown that it's false just because we showed that there were problems with it. That's where this book comes in. This is the Evolution Handbook. It is, and it even says so on the back, 992 pages, 1095. And thank you very much to the person who sent this to me. If you read through the back of this, it's a powerful book which is unanswerable. That's a curious way to start. Thousands of scientific facts disproving every basic area of evolutionary theory. I have not read the book. I did thumb through it. I would probably be willing to bet that I could open to a random page and read something from it and at least have some understanding of where the problem lies. Evolution requires new organs. It's not enough for mutation to produce changes. They must produce new organs. Billions of mutational factors would be required for the invention of one new organ of a new species, and this mutations cannot do. Well, clearly, they're ignoring the possibility of time, in the sense that a mutation could cause an existing organ to develop mutations that are not detrimental at the time, so they're not selected against, and yet over time they begin to take on a function of their own, as sort of like a bile duct off of something, or the difference between the stomach and the stomach connects to the esophagus, the stomach, the the intestines, etc., on out, could have just started as a tube, and then there were pockets in there, and all of a sudden the stomach, which is now viewed as an organ independent, which is still part of the gastrointestinal system, begins to develop a function where food just basically sits in there and marinates in a way that it doesn't in the intestine, and that there may be different wall material that allows us to extract nutrients, which may not have been essential or may just be better at extracting nutrients than before. And that's just one of countless examples in this book, and I'm not even a scientist. So there are things about it that I could get wrong. So my question then becomes, let's say that I went through this book and I was able, let's say there's 1,000 claims on the 992 pages, and I was only able to offer scientific counters to 300 of them. And the other 700 claims that are in here, I didn't have a way to assess. And then I take this book to evolutionary biologists or just biologists in general, and they're able to counter a bunch more. And yet we're still at like 300 things that science doesn't explain, or that people could reasonably view as an objection to the theory of evolution by natural selection. Does that mean creationism is true? Does that mean you've debunked the entire model? No. The fact that a model might be inaccurate or incomplete is no more relevant than the fact that your intestines might have been incomplete at some point. There's new information that comes along. Mutations can cause duplications, replications, it can add, it can subtract. And the view is that, oh, we're talking about a change in the genome that immediately results in an eyeball, or immediately results in a spinal column, or immediately results in some other cell. It completely dismisses the gradual process that what evolutionary theory would say is that in some occasions you could argue that evolution is selecting for things, like this makes you better at survival. You could also view it that it selects against things, like this is going to kill you. You know, if you have allergic reaction to oxygen, for example, you're going to die. I don't know any way. I mean, even stuffing you in water is not necessarily going to get rid of that, but then you would need to breathe, and that's a function of human biology. The fact that there are things that aren't yet answered isn't a disproof of evolution. But let's say that, doggone it, this book is thorough and complete, and all 1,000 of their objections show that the current evolutionary model is flawed to the point that we should throw it out. If that were the case, I would, of course, agree with it, if that's what the evidence pointed to and it was the reasonable conclusion. And yet that does not in any way prove that there's a God, prove that there's was a creation event or a series of creation events or how they occurred or anything else. What would happen is we would be back to the point of, I don't know. When we're trying to make a decision about whether we argue against the reasoning for a position or against the position itself, essentially arguing in favor of the opposite, that is both a strategic decision in our arguing, but it is also a position where we need to exercise an understanding of reasonableness. And we cannot simultaneously talk about a proposition that's unfalsifiable and then pretend that we falsified it. And so falsification needs to be understood in the nearly absolute confirmation that a claim is in fact false, to show that it is false. Your position may differ from mine. Depending on the God definition, I'm convinced. I'm not convinced any of them exist. There are many of them that I am convinced don't exist. There are many versions of, let's just say, a Christian God, depending on which denomination you are and what your particular theology is. There are some of those that I think are fundamentally unfalsifiable, and you tend to get explanations for them of, personal revelation and stuff like that, and there's no way to debunk it. There is, though, still a way to conclude that it's unreasonable when it broadens that theological model. There are other claims that are demonstrably false and yet part of a God package. We now have a better understanding of electricity and lightning bolts and things like that. We now have a better understanding of how the earth formed. If somebody's view is that God actually created Adam and Eve, we know enough about the origins of humans to know that that event did not happen. Even if scientists use a phrase like mitochondrial Eve, They're speaking kind of metaphorically. They're not saying, oh, we've found Eve, the first woman. What they're saying is this is the earliest common ancestor of all humans on the planet. Don't do what the creationists are quite often doing, which is spending all of their time trying to debunk science and no time trying to confirm their alternate hypothesis. They have to do that because they have pretty much an untestable hypothesis. Matter of fact, it shouldn't even qualify for a hypothesis as it's not testable. But if evolution were wrong, that doesn't prove creationism. And to remember that in other conversations as well, that just because there appear to be two sides, that does not mean that you are necessarily convinced of either side. And arguing against one side, even a side that you do not accept, does not mean that you accept the alternate one. That's not the way we should be thinking, and it's, I don't think, particularly effective in argument. And one of the things that strikes me about this is the number of times that theists, predominantly Christians, comment on debates that I've done. They are quite often very, very frustrated. Well, Matt doesn't argue for the position that there is no God. He just comes up and points out flaws in what he sees as wrong with the theological models. Correct. Because my position in the debate is not, I can prove you wrong. It's, I'm not convinced, and I can explain to you why I'm not convinced. And that the reasonable position, the rational position, is to not be convinced. Because the issue here isn't there is a God. The issue is there's good reason to believe there's a God. And that I wholeheartedly reject. Not there is a God, which I may reject depending on the definitions and everything else, but that there's good reason to believe there's a God, that is easy to reject. And that's why I argue against that one specifically. It's a little different in other circumstances. And there are going to be arguments about, oh, well, you're really an agnostic. No, I am, depending on your definition of knowledge, an agnostic atheist. I did a whole video on labels, and at the end of the day, I pointed out that it doesn't matter to me what label you use, and if the labels get in the way, throw them out. What I'm talking about is the process by which we can have arguments and better arguments. And we need to make sure that we're not confused about what we're arguing for or against, or what that says about our position, and that the person we're arguing with and anyone who's watching it is also not confused. And this is why I make efforts at most of the debates to be very clear that what I'm saying is, you have not met your burden of proof, your burden of evidence. You have not convinced me. This is why quite often the biggest response is, well, we didn't convince Matt because Matt's just not reasonable. And that will never work. Because if my objections are about reason, and all they can do is say, well, it was enough evidence to convince me, that's not a demonstration of reasonableness. That could just be a demonstration of gullibility. See you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.